Hi guys, this is Leela. Welcome to my channel Leela WebDev. In this video, we will learn about the different types of storage types that are available in the Docker. Actually, in our previous videos and all those things, we have touched about the storage types like volume mount, dynamic volume, static volume. When we are trying to create the Docker file or the container with our custom image build, we have slightly touched about the storage types. Now in this series or in these videos, now we will try to learn about the different types of storage types available, and we will try to learn one by one each one. So let's try to learn it. So today in this video we will learn about the Docker functionality, that is nothing but Docker storage. Let us understand why we have to go for this storage. So this is the diagram of this volume mounts which is available. So normally we are having two types of volume mounts, but two types of mounts, storage types. Normally we can say it is a data storage. One is bind mount, and another is volume mount, and another one is Tmpfs Mount. So these are the three different types of storage types available in the Docker host machine. And if you try to see here, this is the entire host machine. And if you try to see the bind mount, we are having access to own the entire file system. It will be able to have the access, whereas the bind mount. Whereas this volume mount, it will have only access to the Docker area only. Whereas this memory, you will be able to see it has access for the memory. That is nothing but the container data will be stored in the RAM. Whereas here the container data will be stored in the file system. So that means entire file system container can able to access. Whereas the volume only in the Docker area, it will be able to access. In the previous image, you have a container, and in the container the application is running fine. How long this particular application will run? Until you delete this particular container. So right, so until and unless if you delete this container only, up to that the application will be running. If I stop the container, the application will go down. If I terminate this container, the data will be lost. So this is common thing. That is the reason why we say containers are ephemeral. What is the meaning of this ephemeral? Why we call this as an ephemeral? The container will be available until I don't delete them. The applications will be running until I stop them or until I delete them. So applications will be running as long as the container is available only. So that is why the containers are called as an ephemeral. If the containers are deleted or stopped or removed, anything means the data, everything, whatever it is available, the application, everything will be lost. So we need to overcome this particular situation for the container, which means that even though the container got deleted, it should not lose the data. So that is main thing. So even though the container got deleted or a container got restarted, anything means I should not lose the data. In those situations, we use something called as a data storage. So that is the main thing. In Docker, we have two types of storages. One is storage drivers and another is the data storage. So now we will be concentrating more on the data storage only. We are not concentrating on the storage drivers. We'll try to see afterwards about this one. First, we'll try to have a look at this data storage. So we'll talk about this container, about data storage only right now in this video. In container, data storage, again the data storage, we have three types of functionalities. One is volume mount, bind mount, and the Tmpfs mount. So these are the three types of functionalities available again in the data storage, not in the storage drivers. So the first one is bind mount is nothing but your entire file system on your host machine will be used by your containers, which we have seen in our image. I have shown you that image, right? So in the same thing, the entire host machine file system, the bind mount can able to access. Whereas the volume mount means only your Docker area will be used by your containers. The entire file system, we can use it for our containers. Then it is called as a bind mount. I can only use certain portion on my Docker host machine that can be utilized by my container to save the data. That is called as a volume mount. What I am trying to tell, only a certain portion of the Docker host machine can be, if it is utilized by the container means, then it is called as a volume mount. Whereas the entire file system, if we try to use it for the container data means, then it is called as a bind mount. So these are the two differences. And the another one, Tmpfs mount means the data of the container is stored in the memory, not in the disk. So both bind mount and the volume mount, the data will be stored on the disk. Whereas the Tmpfs mount, the data will be stored not in the disk, but not even inside the container also. It will be stored in the RAM. I will tell you what kind of applications or what kind of information for which we have to use which kind of storages. I will try to tell you. First of all, let us learn about the volume mount. Volume mount can be controlled using the Docker API. So whatever the Docker API's commands we are having, right? Docker volume, these all things, we can control it. If I want to create a volume mount, I can use Docker CLI commands or I can use API. Using any one of them, I can create a volume mount. That is one thing. Volume mount, so we have a Docker vol CLI commands also. If I try to say Docker volume ls, I have shown you in our previous videos. And also using the API means while creating the container, we have used -v option, ---- mount option. We can use it like that. So using any one of them, we can create a volume mount. Volume mount shares the host file system under Docker root directory. So now I told you, right, only at the Docker area, the volume mount will be having the access. That Docker area is nothing but called as a Docker root directory. That is by default, it will be var/lib/docker. If you want to change it means you can customize it. But by default Docker engine, the var/lib/directory is the default Docker area. And inside this Docker folder, a volumes directory will be created. Inside these volumes, whatever the volume mount you are trying to create, it will be created. Whether it is a static volume or a dynamic volume. How can I know the Docker root command? So the Docker root command I am trying to tell you that it is var/lib/docker, right? So if you want to know what is the Docker root command means, if you type docker info command, at the bottom of the output you will be able to see a Docker root directory. This means that the entire Docker related information will be stored in the directory. That is nothing but var/lib/docker. Whatever you do in the Docker engine, everything will be stored under this directory. That is the reason it is called as a Docker root directory. Now your volumes will be stored under this directory in the volumes folder, which we have told you. When I create a volume using the Docker API, the volumes will be created under this directory. Without creating the volume as a prerequisite, that means you can launch the containers. So without having a volume or without creating the volume, you can directly launch the containers also. That means I will not create a volume, but I can create a container. Just like the container creation without the image download. For example, let's say that when you want to start a container, Nginx container, you want to start it. You don't have the image available in your local system. Then what you will try to do, so still you want to create a container means, just you will try to type the command docker container run, like that you will use it. Then what the Docker will try to do, first it will try to search for the image available in the local file system or not. If it is not available means it will contact the Docker hub and it will try to download that image. And it will place it in our Docker images directory and then afterwards it will create the container. In the same scenario, if you are trying to create the container without creating a volume means, first it will create the volume, then afterwards the container will be created. So this is what I want to tell you. In the same way, when we try to create a container, Docker API first it will create the volume and then it will create the container. Single volume can be shared with the multiple containers. So this is another one. Single volume we can share it. So you have a single volume and you can share it with the multiple containers without any problem. We can attach volume as read-only to container to ensure data is not controlled from application inside for write application. What I am trying to tell you is, so you can attach the volume to the container as a read-only mode. So that means the container cannot have access to manipulate the data inside the volume mount. So that means the container can only read the data, it cannot write the data or it cannot manipulate the data. That means as read-only mode, the container cannot manipulate the data which is stored in the volume. Only we have to modify from there only. That means from the volume mount only we need to modify the data. The containers cannot have the right to do it. This is one of the feature available in the volume mount. So you can do it like this also. So attaching the volume as a read-only to the container. Volumes can be used while creating a container using the -v option or --volume option or --mount option. So using any of these options, you can create a volume mount. You can also use any one of the options to create a volume and you can use it for your container. That is what I want to tell you. When we want to use volume mount for Docker Swarm tool, right now we are using the Docker engine, right? So if you are using a Docker Swarm tool means, it is recommended to use only -mount option instead of -v option. So if you are creating a volume mount in the Docker Swarm tool means, then you need to use the -mount option only. We can create a static volume and a dynamic volumes as well. I have shown you about the dynamic volumes also. Static volume is with is having a specific name. So you can create both the things like static volume and also a dynamic volume. Now let us see about the next volume type, that is the bind mount. Bind mount helps to store the data of the container application anywhere in the root file system or the parent directory. Whereas the volume mount, if you try to see, it will be stored, the container data will be stored only in a particular folder or particular path. That is nothing but var/lib/docker inside the volume directory it will be creating. That is nothing but Docker root directory. Whereas if you are trying to create a storage data with using the bind mount means, then you can store it in your any file system, like in the /var you can store it, /user you can store it, in parent directory, in the root directory you can store it, like that you can store it without any problem. Whereas in the volume mount, your data will be stored only in a particular path, that is nothing but this var/lib/docker, not outside of it. You cannot store it outside of it. That is the reason why it is called as a Docker area. When you are using the bind mount, we need to pass the full path or the absolute path, not the relative path of the Docker host machine to mount. So that means when you are using the bind mount, we need to provide the full path or the absolute path. So you need to provide a full path or the absolute path for the bind mount. For the bind mount, like /var/user, everything you need to put. So we should not pass the relative path to the Docker host machine. Whenever you are using the volume mount means, so you can give the relative path. So that means it will be related to the Docker root directory. It will be. Bind mount allows access to sensitive files on the Docker host machine. So that means if you have a bind mount, then it will allow access to the sensitive files in the Docker host machine, which has to be used only when needed. You have to be very careful while using the bind mount, because the container has full privileges to modify the root in the Docker host machine. That is the main thing you need to understand. Bind volume expects file or directory to be available while using the -mount option. So whenever you are trying to create a bind mount option, bind volume, then if you using the -mount option means, what it will try to think is, the must and should, the absolute path directory will be mentioning it, right? The directory should be existing, so you should be creating by your own, and then only you need to use the -mount option. It will not create if it is not available. Whereas in the volume mount, if the volume is not available means, it will create the volume and it will start using the container without whether you are using -v option or -mount option. Whereas in the volume mount, it will directly use it without any problem. In case when you are using the -v option means, so in the bind mount, if you are using the -v option instead of -mount option means, then the file or directory, if it is not available means, it will create it if not available. So that is the difference between -mount and -v. -mount means it will the must and should, the directory should be available, and if it is not available means it will not create. Whereas in -v option means, if the directory is not available means, it will create the directory for you. Bind volume can be shared to multiple containers as well as like volume mount does. So we can also share the bind volumes to the multiple containers as just like the volume mount. While using the Docker Swarm tool, the recommended option is -mount option. So if you are using the Docker Swarm tool instead of Docker Engine means, the recommended option is -mount option. If you are using Docker Engine means, then you can go with the -v option also. That's not a problem. Now let us see about the third type, that is nothing but Tmpfs. Bind mount and the volume mount is the two things which we need to concentrate more. The third one, Tmpfs, is optional. It is not that recommended. But let us understand what is Tmpfs mount. Tmpfs mount will not store data of the container on the disk. It will be storing in the RAM. So this is already we have discussed. So the Tmpfs mount, if you have created means, then the data will be stored in the RAM. In general, we have to use this option when application does not need sensitive information to be stored on the disk and not available across the lifecycle of a container. So that means if the application doesn't need a sensitive information, even if the container got deleted or even the container got stopped, it doesn't need the sensitive information means, then you can use this Tmpfs mount. If it needs the sensitive information, even if the container got destroyed or deleted means, then we need to store it on the disk. We can use either -Tmpfs or -mount option, not the -v option. So we need to use either -Tmpfs or -mount option, not the -v option. If you are using Docker Swarm tool, we need to use -mount option only, not the Tmpfs option. So this is the things which you need to understand. So these are all the different types of data storages that are available in the Docker. So we'll try to learn one by one in the practical implementation also. Hope you understood about the three storage types: bind mount, volume mount, and also the Tmpfs mount. If you have any doubts or any suggestions, please post the comments below to this video. And if you like this video, please do support me by subscribing to my channel. Thank you.